The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to connect you this morning with Senator Tommy Norment. Good to see you, sir.
Woody, it is an absolute delight to be back with you, my friend.
You're still the Senate Republican leader, and I know there's a lot going on in the Senate. There's still other changes. I just noticed there's a new seating arrangement on one of the committees you serve, Commerce and Labor. What's going on with that?
Well, I remember my grandpappy used to tell me a new broom sweeps clean. I'm not sure this is a clean sweep, but it's doing some sweeping. One of the things that's going on, actually, Senator Saslaw, who's the leader of the Democrats, and I had been chatting, and he has taken over as the chairman of the Senate Commerce and Labor Committee. And starting yesterday, we are doing a different seating arrangement so that Republicans and Democrats are mixed rather than having the Democrats on one side and the Republicans on the other side. And what we're hoping to do is sort of try this as a pilot project to see if it'll increase the civility. I think when you create that demarcation between the Republicans and the Democrats by seating them on each side, that sometimes when there's a debate, maybe it gets a little more spirited than it should, because you kind of covey up and feel like you've got that sense of security, but also being a little more aggressive. So we're hoping that this will create more interaction between the Republicans and the Democrats on that committee. It hasn't been uncivil, but we're hoping to try this as a pilot to see if it'll increase maybe some of the conviviality amongst the senators.
And I think there was a recognition that expertise still means a lot, whether you're an R and a D, because isn't it the Finance Committee co-chaired now by a Republican and a Democrat?
Woody, you're absolutely right. The two gentlemen that are co-chairing the Finance Committee are Senator Colgan. Senator Colgan, prior to 2012, was the chairman of the Finance Committee, and then starting in 2012 until 2014, Senator Stosh from Henrico was chairing that committee. They both bring a unique set of talents and skills to that job, and the budget is clearly the most important thing that we do in Richmond when the General Assembly is in session. Where you put your money is really an articulation of what your policies are in government. And so we're hopeful that the two of them working together and collaboratively are going to help produce a very fine Senate budget. But also, I think it'll help bridge maybe some of the partisan tensions that went on starting last week.
And I know one of the things you were concerned about and spoke very passionately about during the debate regarding reorganization relates to a new rule that was implemented, which allows a bill that was substantially amended by the House, that has gone from the Senate to the House and back, to be determined by one person, the chair of the Rules Committee.
A lot of that's inside baseball, Woody, but inside baseball can be very important as to what the spectators are observing. It's very interesting. We had a spirited discussion last week. My Democratic friends had been preparing for months to do this. I had about 6 minutes to figure out what was going on, and blessedly, I don't think I embarrassed myself too bad, even though it went on for hours and hours and hours. And some of what I said was from a partisan standpoint, but some of it, and the most important things, were from an institutional standpoint. I think the Senate of Virginia by design is a very different institution than the House of Delegates, and our forefathers did that intentionally. There are more members in the House of Delegates. They have shorter terms. Consequently, they tend to be a little more partisan and spirited than the Senate, who have longer terms, and there are only 40 of us as contrasted with 100 members of the House of Delegates. However, I think the institution of the Senate is very important, and that's probably where I was most passionate, not about a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. I mean, I'm a big boy, and to me, politics is business. You make your decisions. Sometimes you prevail, sometimes you don't. You got to move on. We're here to govern. We're here to do what the people expect. If you happen to come out and be on the short end of the partisan stick, that's the way it is. You can't have the luxury of sitting around and chewing on a bone and complaining for months. I was concerned about the institutional change, and it still perplexes me why the Democrats decided to put a new rule into the Senate of Virginia saying that if a Senate bill goes to the House of Delegates and the House of Delegates amends it, the bill has to come back to the Senate. And in the 23 years I've been here, that bill, as amended by the House, always comes back to the Senate floor. What the Democrats have proposed is that the chairman of the Rules Committee will take that bill and decide whether or not it will go to the floor of the Senate for the consideration. My dear friend and my mentor, who actually was a Democrat by the name of Hunter B. Andrews, who was just an institution within the Senate himself, he took me under his wing starting in 1992 and told me, Tommy, understand the rules. And he also told me, do not put too much power in one individual, that you need to disperse the authority and the power. That way you govern better. If you put too much power and authority in a single individual, then you're going to have difficulties. And I've got to tell you, I take umbrage. That means exception to putting all this authority in one person who can decide whether or not the entire Senate gets to consider an amendment made by the House of Delegates to my bill. My bill. I don't even get input on it. It is preposterous, and I can tell you privately, several of the Democrats in the Senate have come to me, and they said, Tommy, we didn't get it when you were arguing on the floor. You are absolutely right. This is a bad idea. Now, we had such a spirited discussion about this, and I put the lieutenant governor and the caucus leader of the Democrats on the dime on this thing. And now one of the biggest problems is, how do they back away from it without losing face? Because the TV cameras were running. A lot of inside baseball.
Well, let's talk about Gloucester. It's a beautiful place. It's part of your district. I understand that one of the stories about it is that's where Pocahontas and John Smith first met. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I know you know a lot about that community, so tell us a little bit about it.
I've had the privilege of representing either part of Gloucester or all of Gloucester in the 23 years that I've been in the General Assembly. And I'm very proud to represent them. I've made a lot of friends over there, a lot of very good people who live over there. But Gloucester, like a lot of communities, is changing. From a historical standpoint, it's very rich in its heritage. I've always been a passionate student and lover of colonial American history, living in Williamsburg. I've been on the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. I'm on the Colonial Williamsburg Board of Trustees. Gloucester, actually, in the courthouse, has a statue of Pocahontas over there. My good friend Bob Ripley, who is an entrepreneur over there, has a homestead where Wacomico, which was the major Powhatan village, is over there, and he's gone to great lengths to he and his wife to preserve that area. A lot of rich heritage over there. But there's also, it's an urbanizing community. You and I were talking earlier down around Guinea and Maris. There's still a lot of watermen. Tough way to make a living. Last week, can you imagine being out there on the York River, the James River, tonging for oysters, running fish lines? Very tough way to work. But not as many watermen as they once were. Still a little bit of agricultural base in sort of the northwest end of the county, but Gloucester, like a lot of areas, is changing and it's urbanizing. They've got a new board of supervisors over there. It's going to be very interesting to see how this new board is constituted and the direction that they take Gloucester. Like any urbanizing community, and county government, a lot of fiscal stress that they're worrying about. So it's a great place, a lot of wonderful people, and I've made a lot of very good friends over there.
And is the major state road Route 17?
Yes, sir. That's the major transportation artery, a road that runs the length of Gloucester. It's Route 17, so you pick Route 17 up, it comes down through Newport News, through York County, and then you get to pay the toll and cross the Coleman Bridge.
Another toll.
Another toll. Yeah, imagine that. You know, and my friends in Gloucester, and while I don't represent people over there in the Northern Neck or the Middle Peninsula, there are literally thousands of workers that pay that toll every day to go to work at the Newport News shipyard, government employees at Langley, Fort Eustis, Naval Weapons Station. And it's very interesting to me. They've been paying this toll for years. I was referencing Senator Andrews. I remember when we rebuilt the Coleman Bridge and we had to put the toll on there. He and I had some very enthusiastic debates about that toll. And here I hear the people over in Norfolk and Portsmouth are concerned about a toll because they're having to pay it to commute. The people in Gloucester have been paying it for over 15 years, and I will not live long enough to see that toll come off.
And of course, apparently one of your colleagues has a bill that would allow for casinos to mitigate part of the toll that she thinks her constituents will have to unfairly pay.
Well, I would say as far as that casino gaming bill is, it reminds me of a song, to dream the impossible dream.
Good comment. I like that. I know that there's some development issues relating to stormwater management that affects Gloucester. Talk to us about those.
Right before the session, Delegate Keith Hodges and I had the opportunity to meet with some local Gloucester citizens. They're very concerned about stormwater management. Not a sexy subject, but a really expensive and pricey subject if you're trying to develop a piece of property. As a result of new federal regulations, there's a greater focus on stormwater management. That is, when you have a rainstorm, where does the water run off to? And obviously, it can meander its way down into the York River and the Chesapeake Bay. It can pick up nutrients on the way. It can pick up other contaminants. And we're trying, obviously, to continue to revitalize and protect the Chesapeake Bay. But what's happening is these new regulations are requiring developers of property to contain the stormwater runoff that comes when we have a rainstorm. And that sounds like a perfectly reasonable thing. But these regulations are tremendously inhibiting the development of some smaller pieces of property, because say you have a piece of property that you want to rezone and put a fast food restaurant on it. Well, when you pave for parking in the driveway, you've got to do calculations to figure out what the rain runoff is going to be. And then you've got to determine how you're going to contain or mitigate that rain runoff. And frequently you have to construct what we call a BMP. And a BMP is what you and I would call a holding pond. Well, that holding pond can eat up a major, major portion of the piece of property that you're trying to develop. And also, it isn't cheap. I mean, you think, how expensive can it be to come in and dig a hole? It can be really expensive on it, and because you have all these requirements you have to meet, you have to do the calculations on the cubic feet that are running per minute on it. Sometimes there are lining issues. You've got to have a dam issue. You've got to have a spillway issue, and ultimately you've got to dissipate that water. Very, very significant issue to Gloucester.
So how do we deal with that? Because obviously there's a balance between environmental needs, but also the need to continue economic development.
I'm not exactly sure how we deal with it. It's a very pricey situation, and it's not just in the rural areas. I live in a planned community outside of Williamsburg, and we've had to deal with the issues there where we've had to put in wash aggregate guttering to make sure that the water doesn't run off the road surface down into the gullies. We've had to construct spillways, stormwater detention. I mean, it is a universal problem. And I think you hit upon it, Woody, is we've got to figure out how to balance this. Nobody intentionally and deliberately wants to contaminate our waterways. I mean, that's just not what anybody wants. But you cannot bring commerce and the citizenry to their knees by having the federal government impose these very strict regulations that states have to adhere to. I just feel like the current EPA has tilted a little too far, and I think they're disconnected from reality in some sense. So we're going to have to continue to try to deal with that and see if there's in some way we can mitigate it on a state level.
Now, carbon monoxide poisoning became an issue for you as a result of some of your constituents suffering a tragedy. And I know you have some legislation in to deal with that. Tell us the story behind what precipitated the introduction of that legislation.
Woody, I'm glad you brought that up. I think a lot of times the citizens that we're privileged to represent think we get up here in Richmond and we get so wound up in money issues or judge issues or other issues that we forget we're here to represent the people. And sometimes the people is not a mass of people. Sometimes it is just an individual circumstance. And this was an absolute tragic situation that was brought to my attention by just a lovely couple from Gloucester. They had a son who was living in an apartment over a retail establishment. There were, I think, 2 apartments that were over top of this retail establishment. The retail establishment lost its power, but they had an auxiliary generator. So they left the auxiliary generator running at night when they left to close up business. The carbon monoxide rose up from underneath, went into the apartments, and this couple lost their son. Also, a gentleman died in the apartment that was next door. As you can imagine, anybody that is a parent, your worst nightmare is something to happen to your child. I've heard it said so many times, it is a horrible, horrible thing if a parent outlives their child for any reasons. And to lose a child under these circumstances that was avoidable is just horrible. So I met with the couple. Obviously, they're still very, very upset and bereaved about the loss of their son. So they asked me to put in some legislation that would require carbon monoxide alarms to be installed in apartments. It won't bring back their son, but at least they feel like they are making some effort to try to help other families to not experience the same tragedy. I presented the bill yesterday in front of general government. It was amended a little bit, but it's starting to make some progress. A similar bill was introduced in 2009 and did not fare particularly well. So I'm hoping that I can move this along. And the young man who died, his sister came and testified yesterday, and I just was so proud of her. She was very poised, and I just gave her a hug afterwards, and she was so pleased that I would recognize that this was not just a single family's loss, and that their loss could perhaps save other families from going through that same grief. Sometimes we do things just for people because it's right.
Absolutely. Now, has the local school district recovered? I think there was a tornado back in, 2011, 3 years ago, and I think one of the schools was destroyed.
Yes, it was. I don't know. I think Dorothy's tornado must have started coming down because we had one that, of course, ripped through James City County and York County. But Gloucester had a particularly severe tornado that destroyed one of their schools. And as you well know, the cost of constructing schools is exorbitant in this day and age. They had some insurance, but there was a gap between the insurance and what to rebuild a new school or build a new school was going to cost. Gloucester has managed it very well. I certainly have to compliment their superintendent and their school board over there. like any school system, they've been confronted with lots of challenges. The cost of funding, you've got the tension between the Board of Supervisors and the school board.
Sure.
School board presents a needs-based budget. Board of Supervisors is concerned about what they can afford, that natural tension. But to have a disruption like that where you've lost a school, the displacement of students, the emotional upsetting of the students where they feel a certain affinity or comfort within that school and then having to move them to other schools unexpectedly, and then just the monetary cost on it. So Gloucester has adapted very well to it. And every time I drive down Route 17, I look at what used to be the old Gloucester High School when I was in high school back in 1622, and they've done very well in adapting to that.
Lots of issues around education this year, especially K through 12, the most significant one being the reform of the standards of learning. Some suggest that there's way too much rote memorization, multiple choice tests. We need to involve our children at those grade levels more in critical thinking. You are a professor yourself of law at the College of William and Mary. You're used to the Socratic method of teaching. I don't know if that's what we're looking for, but certainly some reforms appear to be necessary.
Well, this, in my opinion, is the Socratic method of learning is not going to work particularly well in K through 12. There used to be a book out, Everything I Ever Learned. I learned by kindergarten. That's a restatement of it. I think particularly critical thinking is a must, that we absolutely must focus on it. We're doing a pretty darn good job in Virginia of preparing our young people through our secondary education system, but there's always room for improvement. I have heard from many sources, educators, legislators, parents, too much testing. And because of teacher accountability, the teachers have to be very concerned about the performance of their students on the testing. I don't know that there is some calculated approach out there that's pressuring the teachers to teach to the test. But in 2013, we passed comprehensive educational reform where we were putting greater emphasis on holding teachers accountable for the outcome as well as administrators. Sometimes we forget that. And so I agree that we need to cut back on the number of SOL testing. There has been a little bit of a debate. I think Senator John Miller out of Newport News is wrong in that in some of the early grades he wants to cut out the SOL on history. That's contradictory to the area that I represent. I happen to think that what took place at Jamestown, the founding of this nation, the first legislative assembly, the first African Americans, the first women, and then Colonial Williamsburg, where the revolution was fostered, in Yorktown, where it was won. I think they're very valuable lessons that young people need to learn at an early age, because I happen to believe that young people need to have instilled in them a civic engagement and a civic contribution. But I do believe the number of SOLs needs to be cut back, and we need to instill some critical thinking. I don't know where the balance is, but the number of SOLs are going to be cut back in 2014. That I can promise you.
Now, what about the ability to maintain local control, especially for local school districts? And of course, there's a new law that allows the state of Virginia to take over a failing school when necessary. There's also a law that will require eventually the grading of schools based upon an A to F scale. I noticed that there's been a little pushback at the local level and here regarding those two pieces of legislation.
Those two initiatives that came under the McDonnell administration were passed in the 2013 session. They were controversial then. Candidly, there was a little bit of a partisan debate that took place. What I do know between the 2013 session and the start of the 2014 session, I've heard from lots of educators, lots of school administrators, and there has been significant pushback both on the A through F grading and taking over the school districts. And you understand it. On one side, there's the argument that parents ought to have some transparent way of seeing how the schools are performing, and A through F does that. On the other side is, does that create a greater stigma for that school on taking over a school because of its underperformance? Is that a good thing? Well, you're interfering with the local government taking over a school. You're interfering with the school board. But the other side is, do you continue to let a school system fail? Now, to get very specific about it and very quick, Petersburg is an absolute tragedy. We have lost, you, myself, Virginia, have lost a generation of young people in Petersburg because they cannot get their act together on their school system. They have a small school system. They have been through multiple superintendents, multiple human resource officers over there. We've put turnaround partners in there to work with that school system. And when I look at that system and not picking on them, I think we owe something to our young people. And if it takes something as dramatic as taking that system over from a school board and a local government that has not been able to turn it around, if that is the answer to provide these students in Petersburg with a quality education and an opportunity to be independent of government in the future, then so be it. I've just had a lot of discussions about all of these issues. There's legislation that's working its way through to repeal the A through F. I feel less passionate about that. I think a message has been sent to all school systems, and they know that this is a possibility. And there are probably other ways that we can objectively measure the performance of school without laying a D or an F on somebody.
Got a minute left, believe it or not, and we've got Medicaid to talk about.
Well, I'm glad we only have a minute on that subject.
So please, what's going to happen this session, in your opinion?
Medicaid's a very politically charged issue. My Democratic friends are very insistent about getting Medicaid expansion through. Governor McAuliffe has said that he's not going to sign a budget unless it's in there. On the other hand, there are a couple of Republican senators that are working on an alternative plan. Actually, some polling has shown that if you change the verbiage, the reaction of citizens is different. Who wants to disenfranchise 400,000 indigent people from health care? But if you change and stop talking about Obamacare and Medicaid expansion and put another term on it, people are much more receptive.
Thank you, Senator Tommy Norment. Good to see you again.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.